So, I figure it's time for another Durasill update. For starters, I got much better lights here in the garage now. I got this one here. Oh yeah, look at that. So, about the Durasill. I believe the typical expression is one step forward, two steps back. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly typical, and I tend to take one step forward, 12 steps back, and then another 38 steps forward. That said, if you saw my last update, you might be wondering why the Durasill is stripped back down to bare bones. And at the end of the last video, it was probably 75 to 80% complete, and I was basically just starting to plumb the wiring. Unfortunately, as I was plumbing that wiring, I started to run into issues with how confined this space is inside here, and some of the components were starting to block the route that I wanted my wiring harness to take in the bottom channel. Do I spend a bunch of time trying to hide things and make new holes here and there, or do I just take a bunch of notes on what I've done here and use the time more productively by just recreating the entire thing? So I'd like to introduce 2.0, which is better in every single way. I've managed to develop 2.0 to a point far beyond where 1.0 was, and without all of the accidental and reconsidered and disused openings in the sides that were more or less turning 1.0 into a giant unintentional piece of Swiss cheese. This slot was initially to get my Switch Pros harness in and out of the Durasill, and this hole was for my RJ12 plug, which sends the signal. My RJ12 cable sends the signal from my Victron shunt on my battery monitor up to the monitor screen, which is mounted in the top of the tray. The problem was that I changed my mind in the way that I wanted to run the wiring harness. I initially had my module, my Switch Pros module, mounted to these two holes, and my harness would come out here and then attach to my RCR Force 12 up front, and also my power inverter that I plan on mounting down by my battery bank. But I decided against that because I want the Durasill to be more of a sort of a unit where everything is more or less plug and play. So I can unbolt the thing and just pull a couple harness clips off of it and literally just pull it out of the Jeep. And if I'm doing that, then it doesn't really make sense to have all these harnesses dangling from it and getting in my way when I have it sitting here on the bench trying to work on it. That's enough talk about 1.0 problems. I'm gonna put this up here on my shelf for now until I figure out what to do with it. So 2.0 is actually 3 centimeters longer overall, and that gave me more room up in front of the module inside the enclosure. So I was able to move my RJ12 pass-through up to the front, and I no longer have that giant ugly slot to run my Switch Pros harness out of the Durasill. The harness now just runs a short distance from the module to this clip right here. This is my 2 trigger wires for my SP9100, and I have 2 output wires that trigger my RCR Force 12 up front. And I have these 2 blue clips for my power inverter, which is going to be mounted down on my battery bank. And then lastly, I have my 12 volt power and ground to the Durasill. This is sort of the main power source. I know it may sound trivial, but one of my favorite things about the 2.0 is what I was able to do with the outlets on the side of the Durasill. So this part here has gone through several stages of development over time. In the 1.0 Durasill, it started off as just a simple cigarette style socket to power my refrigerator. Then I found this plate which came with a cigarette style socket and a 75 amp power pole. And then after that, I actually found these mini power pole clips, which are rated for up to 45 amps, which are well beyond what the original cigarette style socket was capable of. So when I moved this over to the 2.0 version, I decided to just build the entire thing flush with the wall here. That way, if any wayward lounge chairs or camping tables or whatever happen to bang up against the lip, I don't have to worry about it cracking or possibly shearing off. So as I mentioned previously, ease of disassembly was extremely important to my design process. That said, in order to pull this entire unit out of the Jeep, there are a total of 2 screws and 3 electrical harness clips. At least that's where it stands right now, because I haven't quite figured out the smartest way to get power up to this receptacle here and from this receptacle back down to my battery bank for shore power. Once I figure that out, then I'll have 2 more wires added to the mix. But even at that, the amount of stuff that needs to be undone to pull the Durasill out of the Jeep is pretty minimal. So supposing the Durasill was still mounted in the Jeep and not actually sitting here in front of me on my bench, what I would do is remove these 2 slide bolts. These are the main bolts that hold the Durasill to the T-track in the back of the Jeep. Once those are out, I have access to the electronical connections underneath and behind the Durasill. So once those 3 connections are disengaged, I can actually pull the entire thing out of the Jeep. Simple as that. There are a total of 5 screws that hold the top and bottom channels together. There's 1, 2, 3 on the cabin side, and 4, 5 on the T-track side. Once those are out, which they are already, give it a little tug over the power pole panel, put a little pressure, and it pops right open. I've cleaned out a lot of wiring and come up with some tricky ways of doing things to alleviate some of the chaos inside here. Notably, my power pole brackets in here. What these 2 brackets do is basically consolidate and centralize the various connections, 12-volt connections between the top and bottom channels. That's sort of the game that I'm playing right now. Before I made these, I had all these groups of random floating harnesses with spade connectors and bulky Deutsch clips connecting the module in the bottom channel here to the accessories along the top channel. And so all that nonsense had to be kind of negotiated down into the empty voids in the bottom channel in order for me to get the 2 channels to slide together smoothly. I now have the wiring running in the corners of the channels and not sort of just doing its own thing in the center. And these run to these power pole brackets, which snap together as you put the 2 pieces together. So when I separate the channels, I don't have to go through and disconnect all these individual clips between the 2. As it stands right now, the comms cable and the RJ12 are the only 2 things that need to be, I don't know why this isn't coming apart, that need to be disconnected in order to separate the 2 halves and walk away with one or the other. Another thing that I've been working on is standardizing the hardware. So whereas I had a bunch of different mismatch nuts and bolts in 1.0, most of that stuff has been standardized to M6. So I wound up buying a new nutsert tool, which seems to be working out okay. I mean, it's Amazon China stuff, but it's getting the job done. So I'm going to go through and change as much hardware as I possibly can to M6 and either M6 or M3. The screws that I have going through my mini power poles here are M3. So the fewer variation in hardware size, I think the better. The more simple it'll be to take it apart and put it back together. That's about it for the Durasill updates, for now at least. But I do have something else that I'm pretty psyched about that I picked up this afternoon, and that is the replacement for my battery bank bracket here. This thing I made a while back. I really like it, but it's too heavy and it doesn't really, I had to modify it a few times, and I eventually just decided to give up on it and redesign it. So instead of this big heavy steel contraption here, I spec'd an aluminum one with a thinner plate. This is probably half the weight of that. And this is drawn up to work exactly the way that I need it to. All of the mods that I was making to that to get it to work right for me, I've made those mods in this new one, in the drawings for this new one. So I got to take this to be bent up tomorrow, hopefully. Fingers crossed, we'll see how it goes.
3 days later.
I'm back from the shop and I've been able to confirm that crossing fingers is definitely not a viable substitute for taking proper measurements. I goofed, and not in a way that I anticipated. The thing that I was worried about most was this dimension here. This is where the batteries fit in, and I don't want to have it too small, obviously, because the batteries aren't going to fit in the track. And I don't want it too wide because they'll be able to shift around and move. But it turns out I nailed that. The problem is the height of the back tray. The bottom face of this tray is supposed to sit flush on the floor to where this slot here fits over the luggage ring here. And that's sort of a safety catch. This is sitting probably 5 to 6 mil above the floor surface here. And so that ring is completely free of the catch. So this is kind of a bummer, but I'm gonna go ahead and make those adjustments to my drawings and send them back to the shop. I do think I can use this one in the meantime. I'm gonna put it together real quick and make sure that everything else lines up. If it does, I'll probably put it in the Jeep and use it for the time being, at least until I get the second tray.